Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Khan Academy Daily Homeroom live stream. For those of y'all who are wondering what this is something that we started when we started seeing the school closures really around the world as a way to stay connected and have interesting conversations about things related to the crisis, education, or just frankly, interesting conversations. Before we get into today's conversation, which will promise to be interesting, I'm using that word a lot right now, I do want to make a special shout out to several corporations that stepped up. We are not for profit. We only exist through philanthropic donations. We were running at a deficit even before the crisis. And now our server costs have gone up. We're trying to accelerate a bunch of programs. So special thanks to Bank of America, Google.org, AT&T, Fastly, and Novartis for stepping up really in record time and helping us close that gap. We do continue to run a deficit. So with any donation, even a $3 or $5 donation, those add up. And that's what allows Khan Academy to do what we do and make it free and non-commercial and accessible to students all over the world and teachers and parents all over the world. So with that said, I'm eager to introduce our guest, Angela Duckworth. Angela, how are you?
I'm fine, Sal. How are you?
I'm doing all right. And Angela, you have the distinction of being our first repeat guest on the live stream.
I'm so excited. I hope I don't blow
That
it.
must be based on something. We don't just do that willy-nilly.
Okay,
So
I'll take it as a compliment.
it is a compliment. So for those of y'all who did not see the first episode with Angela a few weeks ago, Angela is really one of the world leaders on talking about mindset and in particular grit and how grit relates to things like resilience and growth mindset. And so you can imagine in this COVID socially distanced world we're all living in, where we're trying to figure out how to keep people motivated, how do we keep learning, and that's how do we deal with everything going on with our lives. Angela is a really interesting person to talk with. And we have a bunch of questions already from our last session that I hope to get to some of them. But for any of y'all on Facebook or YouTube, feel free to add questions. And we have team members at Khan Academy who are going to be surfacing them to myself and Angela. But Angela, maybe a good place to start. You know, last time we talked a lot about growth mindset and grit. And it's kind of this, you know, you can easily get into this view that like, look, if you have a growth mindset, you fail, you hit some adversity, you just keep chipping away at it and eventually you'll get to the other side. But how does that equate with the other notion that, you know, not everyone has the same starting point, not everyone has the same tools at their disposal. So you know, there's growth mindset and grit and resilience, and then there's equity, really.
Yeah, I have lately been, not just lately, I have been reading criticism of my work and also Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset. And when I get past the natural human reaction, which is total defensiveness, and I really listen, I hear something that's really valuable. And I think the critiques are that if you talk about grit, resilience, and growth mindset and character, it sounds like it's all about the kid, it's all about the student, and the entire burden of responsibility falls on their shoulders. And there's no mention of equity and poverty, lack of opportunity, you know, massive differences that we're all well aware exist not only in our country but around the world. And I think the reconciliation is this: it is not that these ideas about mindset and learning and grit are, I think, at odds with, it's not an either or, like it's either the situation or it's the person. It's both and. And, very briefly, I'll just say, Sal, that in psychology, there was like a war between people in psychology, psychological researchers, who thought that, so much of our behavior was about our personality and who we were. Then there were the other psychologists who said, no, it's really about the situation. And the war is over because really everyone recognizes that they both matter. I was once in a classroom in a public school that shall remain nameless, but these two boys were sitting at their desks. All the other kids were doing their work. They were all on these laptops, pounding away at some assigned activity. These two kids were doing nothing. Now, if you walked in just at that moment, you would say, well, those two kids don't have grit. Those two kids are doing nothing. But I walked in actually before the bell rang, and I saw all the students walk up to the laptop cart, and these two boys were last in line, and they got the two broken laptops. They couldn't do anything all period because they lacked opportunity. And I think that's the mistake that I hear critics not wanting to make, not to mistake lack of opportunity for lack of grit. And I, have to say that I completely agree with that.
That's powerful, and your example is a good one. If you got the broken laptop, I mean that's an extreme example. Of course, you're not going to be able to even apply your grit or your growth mindset. And it is fascinating how, in many times in academic circles, people can get into these religious camps, but it's clearly not one or the other. To your point, that environment and opportunity for sure is going to make a difference. But whatever set of cards you are dealt, if you are able to approach that with a growth mindset, given that context, you're going to get further, all else equal. That's not to say that if two kids don't get to a certain place or the same place, that you can somehow blame the kid who didn't get there on their lack of mindset. It might have been other things. It might have been a context. So yeah, it makes all the sense in the world to me on that. And I mean, just double clicking on that a little bit, there's a question from Facebook. Richie Gittler asks, and I think a lot of parents are wondering this for at least one of their children. How do you help inspire a kid who wants to practice, want to practice something? Is it essential that we simply do things we like to do in order to be successful? And we touched about that a little bit in our last conversation. But yeah, how do you motivate someone to practice? Maybe something that it's not obvious that they love it. Or do you just say, well, only do the things that you love? Or I guess, how can you learn to love things?
Since our last conversation, which is now a few weeks ago, Sal, I've been thinking about what you said in that part of the conversation, which is you said that pretty much anything can become fascinating to you. And when you need to record a video, you don't record it until you can become fascinated. But gosh, like what couldn't be, what would fall outside of that category? And I've been thinking about it because I wonder whether for you, as like that who you are at your core is a teacher. And so what excites you is as being able to understand something and then being able to teach it and communicate it. You can certainly tell me, but let me respond first to that question directly. I think that when kids are starting out in something, that the thing to emphasize is interest and enjoyment, and to wait a little bit, if you can, to impose, the hardest, most challenging, repetitive kind of practice. And that is because until a child gets engaged in something, it's a very romantic period. In fact, some scientists use the term the romantic period to describe that initial kind of flirtation. Like you kind of have a joy to what you're doing, and then you love it so much that you can evolve into somebody who's willing to do more drills, more like really hard stuff. Now, with school, something, Sal, that you have much more experience with than I do, you might say that, for math, for example, something I know that, where Khan Academy all started, it's not necessarily like if you think to yourself like, well, when is this romantic period going to come? Because, my kid really doesn't love it. I think that even if you could just take it as a principle, right? Like how much enjoyment and interest and fun can there be? Maybe it won't be as fun as, Minecraft, but like the more the better. And the earlier you are in your development as a learner, the more you really need that, I think.
Yeah, the way I think about it, you are right. I realize that my mindset towards certain things maybe isn't as mainstream as we would like. That we would all, I can get excited about almost anything. This weekend, I'm Swiffering, wet Swiffering the house, and I'm fascinated by it.
You're like, how does this work?
Yeah, I love it. I love it. So, I do try to convince myself that if there's something I'm going to do, I might as well enjoy it. I might as well appreciate what I'm going to get out of it. And, a good example, kids for the most part don't complain if they're working out at the gym and they got to run on a treadmill for 30 minutes, or, they're trying to weight lift and they're doing these really weird exercises that work on their forearms or, or something like that, because they know that it's all, well, first of all, they oftentimes will enjoy it because they're like, hey, I'm working on something. I'm building a habit that's going to make me better in some way, more prepared for battle with the world, or understand the world, or be able to engage with the world in a stronger way. So that's my gut sense, is that the more people just appreciate that, the more that even some of the, little hairy things that you have to deal with in academics, you can kind of power through them because you're like, oh, this is going to make me better at being a holistic person. My son takes piano lessons and he loves playing piano. And famously, when you play piano, you have to practice your scales. And
Right.
scales in a vacuum, just going up and down there. That's obviously not composing. You're obviously not going to make friends at a party by just playing your scales. It might not be particularly that fun. But when you recognize that by building that muscle memory and getting better and better at your scales, and even professional pianists practice their scales, the scales actually kind of become fun and become interesting, and you're becoming better every time you do them.
Yeah, and I think you're reminding us, Sal, that what's interesting and fun isn't just objectively what the activity is. There are piano teachers. I specifically know of one named Cindy Lamb in Pasadena, California, who makes scales fun. She makes games out of them. Her students actually enjoy doing scales. So it's not just like, is it enjoyable or not enjoyable, but it's in a way like how it's framed. One thing that makes things really boring for kids is when we don't give them a purpose or a point to it, like, do this worksheet, do this. Why? Just do it. You're not giving the student any reason to feel like this activity is connected to any larger goal. And actually, there is a science of boredom, and one of the ways things can be boring is because it lacks any obvious purpose. Another, and I actually just wrote about this, and I actually mentioned Khan Academy specifically as an antidote to this. So one other way to be bored, so I just said one way to be bored is like, what's the point of this? Another way to be bored is things are too easy or too hard. And either of those create the psychology of boredom. And the reason I mentioned Khan Academy in this little essay is because I think this is why, among other reasons, Khan Academy is so great, because it allows students to self kind of calibrate, and also through your back-end algorithms to deliver to students like what they need in their sweet spot. But anyway, as parents and as educators, I think the principle is, can you make things more enjoyable and interesting? Can you, give kids the bigger picture, like, this is why we're doing these push-ups, or this is why we're doing scales? And also, can you calibrate so that things are neither too easy nor too hard?
Yeah, and I have to remind myself that all the time. I mean, especially with I've talked on this live stream. Our older two, my 11-year-old and 8-year-old, have, for the most part, have been quite good in this socially distanced, remote learning, whatever you want to call it, world. But our 5-year-old has been difficult, and it's very easy to fall into that frustrated parent trap of like, look, you just need to do this one worksheet. You just have to do this one exercise, and but they kind of get entrenched because. And then if you just and then you both escalate, right? And at some point, you're like giving them a timeout because they're screaming at you, or they, and I've had to learn oftentimes the hard way. You just have to sometimes take a step back and say, okay, how do I put this in a context that, in this case, my son, will have fun? Like, can we turn this into a game? Does it not? Does even a 5-year-old will rebel if they feel like they're being forced or coerced, versus if they are invested in the project? And even if they don't see, they it's hard to convince a 5-year-old that, like, hey, by writing better, you're going to have this ability to communicate in the world, and you're going to have to do that the rest of your life. But even just to say, it's building a muscle, it's fun, it's a game, I think is a start. So one thing I forgot to introduce you, but people saw you on your title on the screen, is that you have started something called the Character Lab. And many people here have asked about it from YouTube. Sean Numbo, what is Character Lab? James Liu, question for Angela, a bit about resources in Character Lab. RK Jack, what is Character Lab? So people want to know, Angela, what is Character Lab?
Thank you for those 3 questions, because I'm so in love with Character Lab. It's a nonprofit I started with 2 educators, and its mission is to advance scientific insights that help kids thrive. Now, character is a word that Aristotle and Maria Montessori and Martin Luther King used, but I think commonly it's called social emotional learning or 21st century skills. Call it whatever you want. The list is the list that all parents and educators want kids to develop: gratitude and curiosity, empathy, social intelligence, grit, growth mindset. There's a science behind any of those things that I mentioned. And I think the idea that we're living in exciting times, that rather than just sermonizing to our kids about these things that we hope they'll develop, we can actually draw on random assignment experiments that, show how to improve growth mindset, and ditto for gratitude, etc. So if you go to that website, it's all, like Khan Academy, philanthropically supported. So if you are a parent or an educator in particular, I hope that you find, direct dialing scientists through this website, as it were, because every word on that website is written by a scientist, not by an intermediary.
and I highly recommend it. We've used the Work at Character Lab. I look at it sometimes to reference myself as family, and we have a lab school we started, and we've leveraged a lot of the Work at Character Lab to think about, because one of the things we try to do at the lab school is not just kids are developing academically, but social emotional development is a very explicit part. And we've used a lot of the taxonomies and frameworks from the Character Lab to think about how do we even, what dimensions matter, and how do we even measure or think about measuring some of these things. So from YouTube, we have a teacher here, Daniel Kinris, asks, how can teachers encourage grit during remote learning? With students out of reach, it seems easier than ever for students to give up.
This is a question that is near and dear to my heart. I have an 18-year-old and a 17-year-old at home, a little bit farther down the track than you, Sal, in terms of how old my kids are. But when there's not only distance learning, but there's also this like very blurry line between morning, afternoon, and evening, between weekday and weekend. It's just very easy for like suddenly like 9 days to slip away and like nothing really got done. So it's a terrific question. I think the person that I've turned to the most during this distance learning period for wisdom is Ron Berger. And Sal, the expeditionary learning schools, and Ron in particular, as the chief academic officer, is such a sage on these things. And I think what his advice would be is to actually take the opportunity of distance learning and this, enforced strangeness that we have as educators, and use it to move more aggressively toward project-based learning, toward things where it's not just like do this worksheet or fill out this thing. It's like we have a project, like we're going to try to figure out how to make like recycling work in this neighborhood, or you could do something that's very COVID specific. Like there are lots of older people in our neighborhood. How can we take on as a project like getting them their groceries? Now, some of this stuff you're thinking like, how does this have to, what does it have to do with like reading, writing, and arithmetic? And I think there, it's not easy to like always draw the line, but that's the challenge. In other words, when you do projects that are authentic, you do have to do a little more work as an educator to think how you're going to integrate some of the basic skills that we need students to learn. But the tilt, I think, is really powerful, because when you do have a project that you're excited about, you're not like dragging yourself out of bed to force yourself to do it. You're excited to do it, and you're kind of thinking about it, frankly, like all the time. So to learn more, I think if you Google expeditionary learning and Ron Berger, you'll find that he's writing a lot of wise things right now.
And you bring up an interesting point. We talked about these kind of camps, these dogmatic camps that sometimes form in academic circles before. We were talking about, is it about context and equity, or is it more about mindset? And to your point, it's not an either or, it's both matter. And I've seen a similar, because we were talking about project-based learning, I've seen a similar type of dogmatic battle in education circles where there's, I guess you could say, the traditionalists who would say, no, you've got to learn those skills. You got to learn, practice your scales, so to speak, before you become a great pianist. And then you would have the more, you could say, progressive educators, project-based oriented program, who are like, no, you should start composing on day one. So it becomes interesting. But what I heard you say is it still is a bit of a both. It's not all or nothing on one side or the other.
Yeah, absolutely. Both and is pretty much the answer to so many questions. And I think that is because there are trade-offs, right? And in project-based learning, you get certain advantages, but, maybe you don't get the, super, densely packed, like, repetitive skill part, right? But then when you just do that, then you maybe lose a little bit of the intrinsic motivation and the purpose. And we're just talking about how that can be really demotivating. So I think with project-based learning and maybe more traditional instruction, I mean, I'm not a expert or veteran educator, but it does seem to me that they are complementary. And when you see the best schools and the best classrooms, and frankly, like, just the best learning environments more generally, there tends to be both rigor and autonomy. There tend to be, both creative projects and like a systematic approach. And this is, again, why it's not easy to do, but I do think it's what we're all aiming for.
Yeah, completely agree. I'm just using a sports analogy. If you're a football player, you obviously have to practice playing football. Like you have to play in games like that are real games. And that's kind of the projects, but you'll also do sprints and weightlifting and, drills, catching or throwing just different random exercises that feel a little bit, and you'll perfect those exercises. But once again, if you just did that, you'd be like, what's the point? But when you know
Right.
that, hey, this is making me more prepared for a game, and I may or may not use some of these skills in a given game, but it's useful toolkit for the rest of my life, then all of a sudden that too can be motivating. And that's what I tell kids. I was like, look, I'm not sure whether you're going to have to use this method for factoring a quadratic in some point in the next 5 years. I am genuinely not sure, but I am sure that understanding this is going to be, you can build on it so that you can learn things like statistics, you can learn things like trigonometry. And I can't tell you how many areas, I mean, statistics, you talk about a project, almost any project, if you want to do it legitimately at a kind of a impact the world level, statistics is going to be a piece of that. Almost anything that you're making, designing, creating, trigonometry, geometry, and some basic level of algebra is going to be a part of it. Anything you do in this world, being able to have reasonable reading comprehension and writing capability is going to be kind of table stakes in this world. So it's good to make sure that you don't have that one spelling error that, you're like, well, what is, DeSalle, is he literate? Which I'm guilty of sometimes. I always blame it on typos, but it's, typing
No,
too
but you're
fast on
so
my
right
phone.
though. Like having that conversation in a like, sometimes people ask me like, well, how old your kids need to be before you can talk to them at a level of sophistication about, some of these, issues like the metacognition. Is it too beyond them to like, really understand why they're doing this thing? Why am I? And I'm like, it's pretty much never too young. Really, honestly, like just start. I mean, kids are smarter than you, so don't use jargon. If they don't understand, try to explain it another way. But I think, one of the big changes in education, I wonder if you agree, Sal, is, well, I hope it's a change in education, is that, I'm not saying that like the student and the teacher are interchangeable and there's no reason why we even have to. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that students are remarkably perceptive and intelligent, and they can understand when you say like, this is why we're doing this. Like the scope and sequence looks like this, and like we have to get through this part so you can get to this part. If you don't get this part, so I think they're not too young to understand any of those things. And we should never assume that they're too young to understand those things. We should always at least try to communicate to them like the why of what they're doing.
I agree 100%. I think it's so easy for us to assume our 5, 6, 7, 8 year olds, that they don't think about how the world works, but they do. And if you talk to them about jobs and the competitive workplace and how and what skills you need to be able to participate, it's funny. I think this was many years ago. It was like 5 or 6 years ago. I got an email from a mother, and she had a picture of her child, and he was working like diligently. He was a 7-year-old. I felt bad. So there was some interview like this where I was talking about the future of work, and that the future of work is going to be defined by your ability to keep learning, that you're not just going to have a set of skills that you can apply until you get your pension, that automation and even some, is going to make labor,
right?
artificial
Yeah.
intelligence, robotics. So you want to be able to participate at the top of that pyramid in the knowledge economy and get as many people there. And so this a mother, I guess, saw that interview with her 7-year-old son. And then immediately after that interview, he went to his room, and like she didn't like see him for another hour. And like she went to the room. She's, what are you doing? He's like, I'm working on Khan Academy. And she's like, why? He's like, I need to make sure I don't get economically marginalized. And I think he used words like almost economically marginalized. So clearly a precocious kid using words like that at age 7. But he said something that felt like, I want to make sure that I don't get like, automated out of the economy. So he definitely understood. And that's kind of that. I remember there's, I'm dating myself. There's a Karl Malone quote, famous basketball player for the Utah Jazz. And he used to say, whenever I get tired, I imagine that my competitors are at the gym. And I don't want that to be like, to stress people out, that you have to always be like on top of it. But that can also be a little bit of a motivator, that like, look, you don't want your kids to get stressed out, but you also don't want them to live in a reality where they think that, actually I see this, the fire. I grew up not so wealthy, so I had a little bit of a fire in my belly because, I could say, look, I want a different standard of living. Oh yeah,
yeah.
Oh no, my mom, we were, she raised us by herself, and she was a cashier at some, convenience stores, and so she was, the year I went to apply to college, she was making $16,000 a year, but that, for me, that created kind of a little bit of a fire in my belly. I would see friends whose parents were doctors and engineers and lawyers. I was like, that's a good life. They're living in a nice house. They are able to go on vacations. They go to restaurants. They don't reuse paper towels. Like, that's the life I want. I still reuse paper towels every now and then, but that's the life I want. But you oftentimes worry about, I think, kids who grow up middle class or even upper middle class. They kind of say, oh, my parents did this. This must be kind of easy. This is just the way it is. But then they later get a bit of a rude awakening that, no, the world sometimes can be a pretty, these jobs just don't fall in your lap, that you need to prepare for them. And there are kids with that fire in their belly who are preparing for it from a very young age, because they see the reason at an early age. They say, wow, if I stay on track with my studies and graduate from high school and do well in college, I can live over there and I can go on vacations and I can support my family. And if I don't, I might be living under financial stress for a very, very, very long time. And, to your earlier point about equity, it's not like it's just all about the kid's mindset. It for sure is a lot about support. Even though I didn't grow up particularly that well off, I had a lot of support. I had supports from teachers who believed in me and who took extra attention with me. I was exposed to people who did make it that way, so I was able to even see that side of the world. But it is fascinating how we can kind of keep that motivation by letting people know a little bit about the realities of the world, but without them getting too stressed about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, use your judgment. But I think one of the through lines of what you're saying and what I agree with is that, kids don't need to be like sheltered from, like, my dad, who was not so great at, thinking about how to talk to kids. He just talked to me like I was an adult, and that wasn't always great, but it mostly was, right? So, I learned about supply and demand, and I learned about his particular view of the economy, and I learned about thermodynamics. And anyway, I think kids are so much smarter and so much more ready than we often give them credit for. And if we try, we can have conversations with them about, what it means to be marginalized in the knowledge economy. And maybe we can find words that are like a little more intuitive for them, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try to have those conversations.
I think I'm a little bit like your dad. I'm guilty of actually all my kids, like all of the lullabies I sing to them are like classic rock songs that I happen to know the lyrics for. So like my kids, like their nighttime lullaby, like just last night for, Azad, who's 5.5 years old, I sing Hotel California with him. And so like
you are taking yourself.
He's like, what does it mean that her mind is Tiffany twisted? What's a Mercedes Benz?
Yeah, that's right.
What's colitis? Why does it have a warm smell? And so, but it's
By the
good.
way, if you can explain to me the Hotel California, then maybe I could listen in, because I honestly
it's a
don't know.
deep song. Is it literal or is it figurative? You can check out anytime you like, but you just can never leave.
Exactly.
That's led to a lot of conversations with my kids. What does it mean to check out but not to leave?
To leave. Good. Well, if you ever get to a really succinct, explanation, like an unpacking of the Hotel California, I would appreciate that, because, I'm still.
There's a few times I have to kind of, my 5-year-old's like, why do they stab it with their steely knives? And what beast are they trying to kill? And I'm like, no, let's not go there right now.
Okay,
but yeah, but that's time for bed. Why aren't you asleep? Okay. So here's a good question from Facebook, Stephen Cottrell, before people start getting on my horrible parenting habits. So from Stephen Cottrell, what are tips on developing a sense of purpose among teenagers? Great question.
One of the like less known, but I think really important facts about adolescence is that, teenagers are maybe more purpose driven during that period of life than any other time. And so we have a stereotype of teenagers being selfish and even narcissistic. And really, to the contrary, they're extremely motivated by fairness, by equity, by social change. I witnessed this myself with my own 17 and 18-year-old. I often get like mini lectures on how I think of myself as someone who's like reasonably feminist, and like they update me and correct me when they think that that's needed. So then the question is, like, how do we channel all that adolescent, purpose-driven motivation? And I think one real challenge this particular summer is that a lot of things that I would typically suggest, like volunteer for this or, do that, are, those are foreclosed. So it's going to take a little more creativity and proactivity this summer to channel purpose appropriately for teenagers. One thing that I just heard of is that there are, and I'll send you the links, Sal. It's not perfect, but honestly, I think it's still great ways for teenagers to tutor younger kids all throughout the summer. As you well know, Sal, what the pandemic has done is not only shined a light on lack of equity, but also increased lack of equity. And I think there are a lot of people, including you and me, who are terrified at the learning losses, particularly for less advantaged kids. So if you've got a purpose-driven teenager in the house, I'll send some links over for ways that they could plug in as tutors. And one of the silver linings is, like, it doesn't matter where you live, like, you can find a kid who's in your time zone, and a starfish theory, right? Like, prevent at least one child from falling behind this year.
Yeah, I'll just doubly underline what you just said. For any teenager or any young or any person who says, what do I do with myself right now? There's never been, at least in our lifetimes, a bigger opportunity where even a very young person from their bedroom could actually do a lot of good in the world. To your point, you could tutor other people. You could start a new organization that connects with maybe elderly who are living by themselves, or just people who are living by themselves, helps with mental health issues. And all of these things are set up to be able to do remotely. And if you need to get out of the house, getting groceries for folks, especially elderly, being able to do services for them, help with their gardens, any teenager, any young person out there, if you brainstorm for half an hour, you're going to think of 30 really fascinating ways that you could really support a lot of folks right now.
I've heard of teenagers who are, like, writing their cell phone number on a piece of paper and then just, like, shoving it in mail slots, right? And by the way, as you might imagine, like, not all of the elderly are heavily into texting or, any other. So just, like, saying, call me, like, call me, this is where I live. I would love to, like, pick up groceries or go to the pharmacy for you. Yeah, like you said, Sal, like, when you just sit down and start to make a list, like, you realize that there's so much to do. And I think actually that's when teenagers are happiest, when they're being useful. And it's like an antidote to the kind of despair that I think a lot of teenagers are feeling, like, an aimlessness and, like, oh, all these things are taken from me. But when you start going out and spending most of your day helping other people, like, all of that basically evaporates.
Yeah, I think there's another theme here, which is, there's this thing like teenage angst and they're in rebellion. And my belief is that comes from the fact that they are proto-adults, that in most of human history, they actually would be kind of on the hunting parties. They would be helping out with all of the different things that the village has to take care of, and the cooking, the cleaning, the teaching, the hunting, the fighting, whatever it might be. But in our modern society, and we would do it in a multiple age groups, they would be with their uncles and their cousins and their aunts. And but now we group them into these very fairly narrow age bands, and we tell them to only worry about themselves.
Isn't that weird?
Yeah, your GPA, your scores, your college admissions, your extracurriculars, that's where the angst comes from. Exactly. We're going to rank order you.
So bizarre. I mean, for most of human history, it's actually what you said. People, kids included, ran around in multi-age packs. The 5-year-olds were with the 7-year-olds, the 7-year-olds with the 12-year-olds. And by the way, when you see kids who are 5, 7, and 12, you see spontaneous, like, collaboration, right? 12-year-olds take care of 7-year-olds, 7-year-olds take care of 5-year-olds. Now we're in this really weird era where we're like, let's take 1,000 15-year-olds and put them together so they spend all their time, and then we're going to rank order them, right? So you're just competing.
And they have no tangible responsibility other than these abstract, like, look, I believe you have to learn all this stuff. Obviously, I'm a big believer. You got to learn your biology, your chemistry, your writing, your reading, your math.
So abstract. It's
all abstract, right? And it's all about their own performance in it. It isn't about a collective. It isn't about making it. And to your point, they are the most idealistic. I mean, part of the reason, a lot of soldiers and things are on the younger side. Obviously, your body is very physically able there, but these are some of the more idealistic people. And, in history, sometimes people have taken not so great advantage of that, but they believe that change can happen, and they want the adventures in the world. They don't want to just kind of fall into the day-to-day grind. And so, yeah, 100% agree with you. Wow. Whenever we chat, Angela, the time goes by very, very fast. So maybe we'll, maybe we have time for one
more. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have time for one more?
I have time for one more. Yes.
Okay. Sounds good. Let's see. Let me find a good one. Those are all
Yeah,
great. So this
end
is
on a high
hard.
note.
We have a, let's see.
I'm glad you're
So,
picking.
I, so there's a couple of questions here. I'll group these together. Carly
Okay.
Angstrom, what do you think is the best way to teach kids to break down their own large tasks, and by extension, all of us to break down? We're talking a big problem. You want to solve loneliness. How do you solve, to our earlier point, from YouTube, Audrey O'Mary, are there any strategies that you recommend for staying on task to be productive? And then Brielle Lee asks, how can you connect the lack of motivation towards online learning with staying at home? I've noticed that many struggle to stay on task. So yeah, just any parting thoughts on how do you break things down, stay motivated, stay on task, stay focused?
So I'll just give one suggestion, and that is this intuition that you have that a big thing needs to be broken up into small things is exactly right. And there was research actually not very far away from where Sal Khan lives by Al Bandura at Stanford, now many years ago, where he actually had elementary school kids who were learning math, and in one condition, they had to learn a lot of math. And in another condition, all he did was he helped break down the same math, into sub goals, into smaller parts, and there was a dramatic benefit, and those kids did better. And I think the life lesson, as you say, Sal, not only for kids but for us, is that when you have big things, you break them into small things, and when you take those small things and you break them even further, that's when I think you really get momentum. And I'll just give one personal example. The hardest thing I ever did professionally was to write my book. And when I thought about like writing a book, it was like too big. Then I thought like, well, I'll just work on chapter 1, still too big. Then I thought like, well, I'll just work on like the first half of chapter 1, still too big. And I found myself procrastinating and just never feeling like I wanted to get started. And then finally I broke it down into small things like, today I'm going to write a sentence, maybe. And what I meant by maybe is that like I might throw out that sentence. And now I had broken down the big thing, a book, into smaller things, a chapter, into smaller, so that the thing that I had to do that day was tiny. And actually, I think that was a great strategy, because once I wrote that sentence, I was like, well, since I'm sitting here, I may as well write another one. And in general, I think if we can help kids learn the skill of breaking down the big into small and getting started, then we'll be actually a long way towards helping them finish what they begin.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. That's a lot of my narrative too. If just so these tasks that you can take half an hour, chip away at them, but then you look back on it, you're like, oh, there was a lot.
Yeah, it adds up. It's better than nothing, which is basically what happens when you procrastinate, is that then you're doing
Right.
nothing.
Just get moving. Just get moving. So Angela, thank you so much. I mean, there continue to be so many great questions coming in. But yeah, thank you for all the research you've done and helping us think about how we can ourselves have more grit and how we can think about working with our children to get that going.
Thank you, Sal. I so enjoyed this conversation.
Likewise. So thank you everyone for joining. As always, Angela Duckworth has, both informative and entertaining, and always a pleasure to chat with about all topics. And we have several other really interesting folks coming on. We're going to have Tom Friedman later this week, just talking about the world and this COVID world. We're going to have Stu Schmill from MIT Admissions to talk about how are college admissions, or even the nature of college, may be changing because of this crisis. And we have many, many more guests over the next couple of weeks. So look forward to seeing y'all. And don't forget, we are not for profit. If you're in a position to do so, please think about making a donation to Khan Academy. Thanks, everyone.